Welcome to the second week of Analyzing Global Trends for Business and Society. This week, we're going to take a look at people, at populations. So we're going to take a look at demography. Demography is the study of human populations. Let's first try to understand why we should care about demographic trends in the world. Well, first of all, there are economic implications. From the point of view of production, demography will affect the relative abundance of labor. And when labor becomes more abundant, then wages tend to go down. And that's going to have a very important consequence, which is the global redistribution of economic activity and production. Also, to the extent that women participate in the labor force, that's going to have an impact on wages, on labor markets, and also on the location of productive activities around the world. Now, demography will also have an impact on consumption. The size of the market will be dependent on the number of people. But not only that, also the age structure of the population will have an impact on consumer trends. It will have an impact on the demand for goods, for financial services, for healthcare, for leisure, and so on. And finally, from an economic point of view, demography will have an impact on savings. And from the point of view of the age structure of the population, you would expect, for instance, younger people not to save as much as middle-aged people. And finally, demography will have an impact from this point of view in terms of the flows of capital from higher to lower saving countries. Now, let's think for a second about the political implications of demography. Well, within any given country, demography will have an impact on the allocation of parliamentary seats by district. A district with a lot of population will have more representatives in Congress or in Parliament than a district with a smaller population. But demography will also change voting behavior. People don't vote in the same way when they're young compared to when they're older. And also there are so-called cohort effects. People born in their 50s or people born in the 1960s may behave or may vote differently than people born in the 1980s or in the 1990s. Demography is also going to have political implications from the point of view of international migration, because the demographic makeup of a country will be altered by how many foreigners are resident of the country. And also immigrant communities tend to be concentrated in just a handful of cities within any receiving country. Lastly, demography may have an impact on politics from the point of view of contributing to nationalism. The size of the population, the growth of the population has always been an integral part of nation building. And of course, there could be xenophobic reactions to immigration, for instance, that may also contribute to feelings or sentiments of nationalism. In addition to the economic and political implications of demography, let's also think about the impact of demography on the welfare state. For instance, at the present time, in the rich countries in the world, in Europe, in the United States, in Japan, we see that population aging is putting a lot of pressure on welfare spending, especially in the form of pensions and healthcare. It's also important to think about how difficult it is for governments to reallocate expenditures on welfare across different areas like education, healthcare, and pensions as the demographic composition of the population changes. And lastly, we see that depending on the kind of pension system in the country, population aging can have a large impact on public finances. For instance, in countries like most of Western Europe, where the government pays for current pensions with current tax revenue in the so-called pay-as-you-go systems, it is very hard to cope with population aging. In other parts of the world, like for example in the United States, where a significant proportion of the population has a defined contribution pension, that is to say, they spend in old age the money that they have set aside when they were working, it is easier to cope with the effects of population aging. There's also implications of demography for the geopolitical balance in the world. For instance, bigger countries have more weight in the global landscape. So there is a connection between population size and power in the global arena. Think about, for example, the countries that became more developed in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, such as South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, or Hong Kong. They're all relatively small, especially Hong Kong and Singapore. South Korea and Taiwan are a little bit bigger, but they're much smaller than India or China or Brazil, which are the countries that have become more economically vibrant over the last 20 years. Well, the size of the population matters in terms of how much power and how much economic influence these countries can exert in the global arena. So think about the following question, because we're going to be examining it later on in this class. Is population size related to the geopolitical power of countries in the world? Now, let's provide a more accurate, more precise definition of what demography is. Demography is the systematic, often statistical study of human populations, especially with reference to size and density, distribution, and vital statistics. Demography is a very interesting subject because very small demographic alterations today can bring about very large transformations 5, 10, 15, or 20 years down the road. Also, demographic reversals take years to take place. That is to say, if families today are having very few children, it will take at least 15 or 20 or 25 years for the population of that country to start growing again. And lastly, demographic policies are very hard to design, very difficult to implement, and have effects only years into the future, at least a generation or a generation and a half into the future. So let's start by looking at demographic trends in the world from the point of view of the size of the human population. So we're going to try to answer the question as to what's the projected growth of the world's population over the next few decades. And we're going to try to understand here how we calculate population projections into the future. Well, the answer to that question is very easy, which is that we need to make some assumptions about two key magnitudes. The first is how many people are being born, and we're going to measure that with the total fertility rate. And then we have to make some assumptions as to for how long are we expecting people to live, and that's called life expectancy at birth. So the first of these two concepts, the total fertility rate, is essentially the number of children per woman. So this is the average number of children that a hypothetical cohort of women would have at the end of their reproductive period if they were subject during their whole lives to the fertility rates of a given period, and if they were not subject to mortality. I know those are strong assumptions, but that's the way demographers calculate the total fertility rate. And then the second concept, life expectancy at birth. That's the average number of years of life expected by a hypothetical cohort of individuals who would be subject during all their lives to the mortality rates of a given period. So once again, we see that there are some assumptions built into this second concept as well. But let's see what the numbers look like. So first of all, we are going to be using data from the United Nations Population Division. And they make 4 different assumptions concerning fertility. The first assumption is no change. That is to say, people are going to have the same number of children for the next few decades. The second assumption is the high fertility assumption. The third is the medium. And then the fourth assumption is the low. For most of the charts and figures that I'm going to show you, we're going to be using here the medium assumption. Now, the United Nations makes only one assumption, one variant, regarding mortality or life expectancy. And we're going to be using the medium assumption as well. Now, it's also important, before I show you the first few charts, that the United Nations uses different categories of countries in order to map and project fertility and life expectancy into the future. They divide countries in the world into 3 different regions. The first one is the more developed countries in the world. That includes all of Europe, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. That's the first group. The second region is the less developed countries, and that's most countries in Africa, Asia, except of Japan, of course, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and the Pacific region, excluding New Zealand. And then the third region, which is the least developed region, includes 49 countries, the poorest countries in Africa, Asia, the Pacific region, and Latin America. So let's take a look at the first chart over here, which is fertility projections into the future until the end of the 21st century. On the chart, you will notice that we also have the actual data on fertility starting in 1950 all the way up until 2012. And thereafter, as I just mentioned, we have projections into the future. And the assumption is, as I told you earlier, the medium fertility assumption. What we see here is that as of 1950, the average woman in the world was having 5 children. Today, that figure has come down to about 2.5 children. And the projection is that by the end of the 21st century, the average woman in the world will give birth to about 2 children over her reproductive lifetime. That's the average for the world. That's the thick line on this chart. But let's take a look now at the richest countries in the world, the most developed parts of the world, Europe, Japan, the United States, Canada, and so on. Here we see that women on average were having a little bit less than 3 children back in 1950, and then that figure came down to less than 2, about 1.7 by the 1990s, and is projected to increase slightly over the 21st century. That's for the rich countries. And then let's take a look now at the thin line, which depicts the fertility projections for the emerging part of the world. So these are the less developed countries, but not the poorest countries in the world. The line starts at 6 children per woman, has come down to about 2.9 or 2.8 today, and the projection is that it will converge on about 2 per woman by the end of the 21st century. And then lastly, let's take a look at the poorest countries in the world, in Africa, in South Asia, and so on. Well, the average woman was having 6.5 children back in 1950. Nowadays, it's at a level of about 4, and it's also supposed to be converging close to 2, but it's going to take a long time for that to happen. It's going to take about 90 years for that to happen. So there's 2 very important things to keep in mind about this chart. First is that women, on average, or families, if you prefer to put it that way, are having fewer and fewer children as time passes. And secondly, that at any one point in time, let's say the year 2014, we still see very important differences in terms of the fertility rates by level of development in the world. So in the very poor countries, families on average have 4 kids, but in the very rich countries, we have families having fewer than 2. Now, what this means essentially is that we're going to be witnessing very rapid population growth in the poorest parts of the world. And at the same time, we're going to be observing a shrinking population in the richest parts of the world, except that, of course, there's going to be some migration from the poor parts of the world to the rich parts of the world. Now, let me ask you the following question. Demographers frequently assume that it takes 2.1 children per woman for a population to replace itself over time. Why is it 2.1 and not exactly 2.0, that is to say, 2 children per woman? Well, the answer is actually relatively straightforward, which is that not all children that are born survive to have their own children. And not all children that survive actually have their own children. So that's why, on average, we estimate that we need about 2.1 children for per woman for a population to replace itself. Now think about carefully as to what has been going on in the rich countries of the world, absent migration. Well, the situation is that since about the late 1960s, that was 50 years ago, we see that populations in Europe or the United States have not been replacing themselves because the fertility rate has been below 2.1. This means that without immigration, the population in Europe or the United States would have decreased over the last 50 years. In fact, it hasn't, but that's mainly because of immigration. Now let's take a look at the second important magnitude that we need to take into consideration when calculating the future size of the world's population. That's life expectancy. Remember, life expectancy is the average number of years that people in a particular part of the world are expected to live. And once again, here we're using the medium assumption. On the chart, you can see the same breakdown. So we have the thickest line is for the entire population of the world. And then we have the line above it is for the rich countries. And the two lines below the total for the world are the ones for the less developed parts of the world and then the least developed or the poorest parts of the world. And we can see a couple of things on this chart. The first is that people are living longer and longer no matter where they are located in the world. Life expectancy is growing and is projected to continue that pattern of growth through the end of the 21st century. The second important thing about this chart is that people live longer in the rich countries than in the poorer countries in the world. Now, how about using these two magnitudes, fertility and life expectancy, to make projections about the size, the future size of the world's population? Here we have the official estimates from the United Nations. So between 1950 and the year 2011, what you see on this chart is the actual number of people on Earth measured in billions. And as you know, we have just surpassed a couple of years ago the 7th billion. And then from 2011 until the end of the 21st century, you see the four projections, depending on what assumptions the United Nations makes about fertility. Because once again, they always assume medium life expectancy. And so when you assume that for the next 90 years until the end of this century, women are going to have the exact same number of children that they're having today, then we will end up in the year 2100 with about 29 billion people on planet Earth. Now, as I told you in a previous week, this is not a very reasonable assumption because families, as we know, are getting smaller and smaller. Women are having fewer and fewer children. So the constant assumption is not a very good assumption to make. Well, let's go to the next assumption. The next assumption is the high assumption. Let's assume that although families are going to have fewer children, or women are going to have fewer children over the next few decades, they're still going to have quite a few. And so under that assumption, we would end up with a global population of about 16 billion people by the end of the 21st century. Now, the low-end assumption that the United Nations is working with, as you can see on the chart, would result in the end with a smaller population than the one that we have today, a population of about 6 billion people. The most reasonable assumption to make, however, is the medium assumption regarding fertility, regarding the number of children that on average women will have over the next 90 years until the end of the 21st century. If you use the medium assumption, then the United Nations projects that the size of the world's population will be anywhere between 10 and 11 billion people by the year 2100. So we just saw that the human population is going to grow over the rest of the 21st century under the medium fertility assumption. But we also saw, if you remember, that fertility rates, that's the number of children that the average woman is having in the world, those rates are higher in the poor parts of the world than in the rich countries. And this essentially will bring about a radical redistribution of the human population by region. So let me start by telling you which are the regions that the United Nations Population Division takes into consideration when calculating the relative importance of different populations in the world. We will distinguish among Africa, Eastern Asia, Southeastern Asia, South Central Asia, Western Asia, Europe, and Latin America and the Caribbean. Let me just clarify very quickly which countries are included under Eastern Asia. That's China, Japan, South Korea, North Korea, and Mongolia. Southeastern Asia includes essentially all of the countries in East Asia that are not China, Japan, the two Koreas, and Mongolia. So that's Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and so on. South Central Asia includes every country from Iran to Bangladesh, plus all of the Central Asian republics, also referred to as the STANs. And of course, this part of the world also includes India, which happens to be the largest country. And then we have Western Asia, which includes every country from Turkey all the way to Iraq, plus the Caucasus and the Arabian Peninsula. And also, let's keep in mind that in the following statistics that I'm going to show you, the Russian Federation is included as part of Europe. So let's take a look at the following chart. What we have here is the time period that we've been discussing throughout this segment on demography. From 1950 to the year 2012, we have actual data. And then from the year 2013 all the way to the end of the 21st century, we have projections based on the medium fertility assumption. That's the horizontal axis on this chart. And the vertical axis is the percentage of the world's population that is living in a particular region of the world. So let me just give you a very quick example. What we see on this chart is that about 26% or so of the world's population was living in Eastern Asia as of the year 1950. Now, if you examine the chart carefully, there are two parts of the world which are going to see their population share increase quite quickly during the rest of the 21st century. Can you spot them? There's two regions of the world. Well, the first is Africa, and the second is South Central Asia. So let's take a look at Africa first. Africa back in 1950 was home to about 9% of the world's population. Nowadays, it's home to about 15%. By the end of the 21st century, it is projected to be home to nearly 40% of the world's population. That's what I call a demographic reversal, right? Africa started at 9% and may represent as much as or nearly 40% of the world's population by the year 2100. The second region is South Central Asia, which, remember, includes India. So back in 1950, 20% of the world's population was living in South Central Asia. Nowadays, it's about 25%. It will continue to grow for the next 20 years or so, and then will level off and start decreasing as a share of the total population in the world. And that's because, of course, families in some parts of South Central Asia, especially in southern India, are starting to become smaller. Why do you think that's the case? Think about it. Well, generally fertility comes down when economic growth starts, and also when the population gets more education. And demographers have found that it is very important to keep an eye on women's education, because it happens to be one of the most important predictors of the number of children that families will end up having, or that women will end up having. In southern India, the educational levels of women have gone up over the last 20 or 30 years. So it should be no surprise that families are becoming smaller and smaller while they remain relatively large in northern parts of India. Now let's go back to the chart. And if you examine it carefully, there's two regions in the world that are going to see their share of the total population in the world shrink over the next 60 or 70 or 80 years until the end of the 21st century. Think carefully. There's two of them. The first obvious one is Europe. Europe was home to about 22% of the world's population back in 1950. Nowadays, it's home to about 10%, and the projection is that by the end of this century, Europe will be home to about 6 or perhaps 7% of the world's population. So that's a steep decline from 22% all the way down to about 7%. And the second part of the world that is going to see its share of the world's population decline very quickly is East Asia. Who would have thought that that could happen? So East Asia, China, Mongolia, North Korea, South Korea, and Japan, used to be home to about 26% of the world's population in 1950. Nowadays, it's about 22%, and the projection is that only about 12% of the world's population will be living in East Asia. Now, a large chunk of that decline has to do with China. And if you remember, there are two drivers about population or fertility decline in China. The first, of course, is government policy, the famous one-child policy. But the other, of course, is also economic growth and higher education on the part of women, which, of course, gives them more opportunities for being out, for working in the economy, and therefore they postpone having their first child, and they eventually have fewer children than if they stayed at home. Now, you can also take a look at other parts of the world on this chart, including the United States, whose population is also going to decrease as a share of the total in the world. And you can also take a look at Southeastern Asia, and you can take a look at Latin America and at Western Asia, which is mostly the Middle East. And most of these regions will experience stability in terms of their share of the world's population over the next 50 or 60 or 70 years. Some of them will increase slightly. But really, the game changers are Africa, Europe on the negative side, East Asia also on the negative side, and then finally, of course, South Central Asia, including most notably India, which for the next 20, 30 years will increase, but then it will level off and eventually decrease in terms of its share of the world's population. So one of the most important questions that we're going to be analyzing in subsequent weeks in this class is, what does the demographic rise of different parts of the world mean for the entire world, for the rest of the world? And in particular, we're going to devote some attention to the rise of Africa as a major region in the world from the point of view of demography. So think about that question. Think about that discussion question. We're not going to be answering it this week, but we will be paying a lot of attention to Africa in weeks to come. So when thinking about population projections, we have used so far two interrelated concepts to calculate the size of future populations in different parts of the world. The first concept was fertility, the number of children per woman, and the second one was life expectancy, how long are people expected to live. Now, you might be wondering that that's nearly not enough to really calculate with accuracy the size of populations in different parts of the world. We also need to take into consideration the fact that people move from one country to another. That's called migration. So let me show you this chart. On this chart, we have from 1960 to the year 2010, immigrants as a percentage of the population. But I'm giving you two magnitudes. The blue bars are the number of immigrants in the world as a percentage of the total population of the world. And the red bars are the number of immigrants as a percentage of the population in the high-income countries. Why the distinction? Well, most migration is from poor countries to rich countries. So that's why it's very important to actually break down this measure by income level. So for the world as a whole, that's the blue bars, what we see is that immigrants as a percentage of total population, that proportion has actually stayed very, very stable over the last 50 years or so. It was about 2.5% 2.5 or so back in 1960, and it's about maybe 2.5, 2.6 in the year 2010. However, when you look at the numbers just for the high-income countries, those are the red bars, we see a phenomenal rate of increase. So we see that back in 1960, about 5% of the population in the high-income countries were immigrants, whereas by the year 2010, that proportion grew to nearly 12%, from 5% to nearly 12%. So immigration is a very important force in the world. As I mentioned earlier, this is what is making it possible for the populations in the rich countries in Europe, in the United States, to remain more or less stable, or even to grow, when, from the point of view of fertility, women are not having enough children for the population to replace itself. Let's now turn to the age structure of the population. Depending on how many babies are born, and depending on how long people live, then we're going to see that different countries in the world are going to have more or less people in different age groups. Some countries in the world may have a lot of people in the older age groups, whereas other countries in the world may have more people in the younger age groups. So the way demographers capture the age structure of the population is through the so-called age pyramids. And here we can see the age pyramids for the United States in the year 1960 and the year 2010. Those are actual data. And then we can also see the age pyramid projected into the future for the year 2060. As in all previous charts, we are using here the medium assumption for making the projection into the future. On the left-hand side, in blue, we have males. And on the right-hand side, in red, we have females. Each bar represents the number of males and females for each 5-year age group. Now, it's really important to note that an age pyramid for a relatively young population will be very big at its base and then becoming progressively thinner as you go up in terms of the different age groups. So when we take a look at the evolution of the age structure of the population for the United States since 1960, we see that it is becoming progressively older. Below the United States, we see Germany, also for the year 1960 and the year 2010, and then the projections to the year 2060. And we observe that Germany is actually becoming an old population much faster than the United States. And that's because fertility has dropped more quickly in Germany than in the United States. Next, let's take a look at the age pyramids for two southern European countries, Spain and Italy. 2 or 3 generations ago, women in Spain and Italy were having 3, 4, even 5 children on average. But over the last 20 or 30 years, fertility has also come down in southern Europe. So we see that both Spain and Italy are undergoing a very rapid process of population aging. But it's not only European countries or the United States that are going through this process. There's also emerging economies such as China, whose populations are also aging very quickly. In China, of course, the most important driver has been the one-child policy. But in addition to government policy, in China, we also see the effects of greater access to education by women and greater rates of labor force participation by women, which is also driving fertility down. A very interesting case is Russia. Here we see 2 processes going on. One is population aging, and the other is a growing gender imbalance. If you look at the left-hand side of the chart of each pyramid for Russia, the blue bars, you will observe that men appear to be dying on average at younger ages, much younger ages than women. And that, of course, is to be attributed to bad lifestyles on the part of men in Russia, and in particular to excessive alcohol drinking. And we know that because a very important cause of death for males in Russia happens to be liver disease. And then finally, let me show you the age pyramids for two other emerging economies in the world, Brazil and India. Brazil started in 1960 with a very young population. By the year 2010, we're already seeing that fertility is dropping. So the number of both men and women in the very young age groups, let's say between ages 0 and 15, are smaller than the number of men and women for ages 20 through 35. That's actually good for economic growth when you think about it, because Brazil has more people in working age than people under the working age who are still in school, or people who are above 60 or 65, meaning that they are retired or going into retirement. That's good for economic growth because the working age population doesn't have to support too many old people or young people. Now, of course, if you take a look at the pyramid projected into the future to the year 2060, then we can see that Brazil's population will, of course, age because there's not enough children being born today to replace all of those in their 20s or 30s or 40s. And then India is also a case of a country that continues to be relatively young in terms of the age structure of the population. But by the year 2060, we already will be witnessing the first signs of population aging in India as well. So in sum, population aging has become a global phenomenon. It is happening everywhere, in rich countries, in emerging economies, and slowly but surely also in poor countries. Once again, population aging is being driven by two changes. The first is declining fertility, and the second one is a general increase in life expectancy. Let's think now about the following question. Why should we care about demography from the point of view of financial markets? So we're going to use a specific example. Let's think about what's the impact of population aging on the stock market. And in the following example, I'm just going to show you data for the US. The data come from a study conducted by two economists at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. What you see on the top chart is the time trend in terms of price-earnings ratios for the US stock market between the years 1954 and 2010. So the price-earnings ratio, as you know, is one of the most widely used indicators as to the extent to which the stock market is doing well or not. That's the red line on this chart. And then the blue line is an indicator of the age structure of the US population during the same time period, 1954 through the year 2010. And the ratio is the number of people in the United States between the ages of 40 and 49 divided by the number of people between the ages of 60 and 69. That's the blue line. Now, if you examine the chart carefully, you will notice that there's a very high correlation between the two. So it seems as if prices in the stock market go up when the population is getting younger, and prices in the stock market go down when the population is getting older. Now, if you only take a look at 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, you wouldn't notice the pattern. But if you take a look at the entire period, from 1954 to the year 2010, you do observe that there is this very high correlation. Now, why would that be the case? What are the reasons why stock prices react negatively to population aging? Well, there's a couple of things that I would like to bring to your attention. From the point of view of the economy, it makes a lot of sense, actually, that prices in the stock market go down when the population ages. As people retire, they leave the labor force. So companies can no longer use their skills and their experience. And maybe the economy suffers as a result of that. And given that in the United States, after the baby boom, there hasn't been enough people to replace those going into retirement, this may have had negative economic consequences. Now, a second possibility is to look at the financial markets, and in particular the stock market. Think about what people do in terms of consumption, savings, and investing as they grow older. When people are in their 20s, they're essentially investing in their education. So they very rarely save money. When people are in their 30s, hopefully they already have a good job. They can start saving. Where do they invest that money that they save? Well, they think, I'm not going to need that money until I retire. But retirement is still 30 or 35 years away when you are in your 30s. So therefore, what most people do is they invest the money in high return, perhaps also high risk assets, such as, for example, equities. So they go to the stock market. Now, when people go through their 40s and into their 50s, they start thinking, well, I may be retiring within 10 or 15 years. So they start to shift their investments away from equities, high return, high risk assets, into lower risk and, of course, also lower return assets, such as perhaps bonds. So in other words, people start reallocating their portfolios away from the stock market as they get older. Now, when people approach retirement age, they start putting more of their savings into cash reserves, or they completely cash out from their pension funds. Now, what this means essentially is that as the population ages, there's quite a bit of pressure on the stock market and on prices in the stock market. And that's why on this chart we observe this correlation between the two curves. Now, the two authors of this article also made some projections into the future. And that's what you can see on the bottom chart. So first here, they drew again the line for the price-earnings ratio for the US stock market between the year 1954 and 2010. And then they made projections into the future. They did this based on a mathematical model that included all sorts of variables, not just demography, not just population, age. They included many other economic and financial considerations, such as interest rates, GDP growth rates, and so on and so forth. And what you can see on this second chart is essentially that they are projecting that between now and the year 2022, there will continue to be downward pressure on US stock prices as a result of population aging. But that after that year, one should expect the effect of population aging to reverse itself, and therefore the model is predicting that the downward pressure on stock prices will no longer occur after that year. By the way, in case you were wondering whether the projections in this study were accurate or not, you could always look backward in time to see how the model predicted, so to speak, what happened in the past. And this is what you see in the lower chart in terms of the blue versus the red line. The blue line is the actual data on price-earnings ratios. And the red line is what the model projects moving forward into the future, but also looking back into the past all the way back to the year 1954. And as you can see, over a long period of time, the model actually was very good at predicting where price-earnings ratios in the US have been since the 1950s. So far, we have examined by how much the world's population is likely to grow over the next 50 or 60 or 70 years. We've also looked at how human populations will be distributed around the world. And remember, we've seen that certain parts of the world, such as Africa or South Asia, are going to grow relative to others, whereas Europe or East Asia are going to shrink relative to others from the point of view of the size of their populations. We've also seen that populations around the world are becoming older. That is to say, we're very quickly getting into a situation in which there are, think about it, more grandparents than grandchildren. Next, I would like to tell you about the growth of cities, because we don't only see people moving from certain parts of the world to others, we also see people moving from the countryside to cities all over the world. For the first time in human history, as of the year 2005 or so, we had more people living in cities than in the countryside. That's what you can see on this chart. The thick line is the percentage of the world's population that lives in cities. And it went up from about 30% in 1950 to about 50% by the year 2005 or 2006. And the projection is that by the end of the 21st century, nearly 70% of the world's population will be living in cities. Now you can also see on the chart that in the rich countries in the world, by the year 1950, already more than 50% of the population lived in cities. And that process of urbanization will continue in the rich countries as well for the remainder of the 21st century. But you can also see on this chart that the growth of the urban population has been fastest in the emerging parts of the world, in the less developed regions, and also in the least developed or poorest parts of the world. Actually, in the poorest countries, you can see that today, still only about 25% of the population lives in cities, the rest in the countryside. But the rate of growth in terms of urbanization in the poorest countries in the world is the fastest right now. Now think about the following number that I'm going to give you. Every week, about 1 million people join the dwellers of cities somewhere in the world. Every week. Every month, about 4 million people, which is the size of an average city in the world. Those are staggering figures. The process of urbanization is proceeding very quickly around the world. Now take a look at the following maps. I'm going to show you on these maps of the world where the biggest cities were located back in 1960, and then we're going to move to the year 1980, to the year 2011, and then take a look at the projections for the year 2025. All of these projections are based on the medium assumption that I told you about earlier regarding fertility, and it takes into consideration current and future patterns of urbanization. Back in the year 1960, there were only 2 cities in the world with more than 10 million people. That was New York and Tokyo. And there were, of course, a whole bunch of cities with anywhere between 5 and 10 million people. But usually most of them were in Europe and here in the United States. Fast forward to the year 1980. We see now that there are a few more cities with more than 10 million people. There's a couple in Latin America. And there's many more cities with more than 5 million people. Then let's move on to the year 2011. We see that cities, big cities, are starting to proliferate, not just in Europe and the United States, but most importantly, in Latin America and in Asia, and then also slowly in Africa. And then this is likely going to be the situation by the year 2025, when we're going to have, well, about 10 cities in the world with more than 10 million people, some of them with more than 20 million people. And we're going to have dozens and dozens of cities between 5 and 10 million people. As a result of the trade embargo, the Cuban economy has not been able to develop as quickly as it should, and also because the system of central planning put in place by the regime back in the 1950s is not a very efficient one. We can see here in the Bacardi building to what extent there's been damage over the years and the fact that it hasn't been repaired. And this is just 2 small samples of a city of Havana that once was called the Paris of the Caribbean, and that is now to a very large extent dilapidated. Here I'm inside the Bacardi building. It's one of the areas next to the elevators that took me all the way to the 9th floor, and we can see above another instance of the neglect that over 60 years has essentially turned Havana's proud agricultural legacy into shambles, and it's now, has become readily apparent that millions of dollars will need to be spent bringing these buildings back to life. This is the magnificent entrance to the Bacardi building, built in the finest Art Deco style. It was completed in 1930. Look at the details in the ceiling, including the original lamps. This is the exterior of the Bacardi building. You can appreciate here the craftsmanship that went into the facade. It's a truly spectacularly beautiful building. This is the growth of cities in the world. What we see is a very rapid process by which more and more people are moving from the countryside into the cities. Think about some of the economic implications of the growth of cities. A first question could be about consumer markets. Do people consume different types of goods and services when they move from the countryside to the city? Another kind of relevant question would be, what do you believe are the consequences for the food industry or for the water business? Well, think about these questions carefully. We will be addressing them in future weeks of class, especially when we look at natural resources and energy. But suffice it to say at this point that people change their behavior in very dramatic ways when they move from the countryside to the cities. As more and more people in the world are living in cities, we should expect consumer markets, we should expect entire industries to change as a result of this very rapid process of urbanization. Let me also tell you about another very intriguing aspect of urbanization. I am talking about the rise of global cities. So what is a global city? Look, a global city is a city whose importance and identity transcends the country in which it is situated. Let me give you an example. New York happens to be located in the United States, and it is the largest city in the United States. But above everything else, New York is recognized around the world as a truly global city. It's a city that happens to be located in the United States, but its role in the global economy, its role in global culture, transcends the fact that it is located in the United States. A global city, to quote the sociologist Saskia Sassen, is a place where the work of globalization gets done. So global cities are very big concentrations of economic, financial, cultural, political activities that affect not only that city or even the country where the city is located, but rather they affect the entire world. So we should be paying attention to dimensions such as the economy or finance, politics, culture, and also demographic diversity or ethnic diversity, because most global cities in the world also happen to be very diverse from the point of view of its demographic composition, mostly, of course, as a result of migration. So what are some of the characteristics or the features of global cities? Well, they tend to be large, to be sure, influential, prominent. As I just told you, they tend to be culturally and ethnically diverse. They're also home to very thriving cultural institutions, such as museums, or universities, or schools, or orchestras. They tend to have advanced infrastructure. They tend to be very rich in terms of business services, financial services, consulting. They tend to be open, friendly, and of course, at least to a certain extent, safe. And they also happen to be legally and politically secure. Otherwise, people wouldn't want to do business in those global cities. Now, why do we see global cities emerge in the world? Well, I think there are fundamentally four key drivers. The first is agglomeration economies. You see, when you put a lot of bankers together, or consultants together, or doctors together, or researchers together in the same location, they can all increase their productivity. They become collectively so much more productive. Those are called agglomeration economies. We also see global cities emerge because of the growth of specialized service firms. See, 100 years ago, there were very few banks in the world. There were very few, if any, consulting companies in the world. There were very few, if any, advertising agencies in the world. But today, we see that the global economy wouldn't work without those specialized service firms. Many of them are located in these global cities. Global cities also grow because they serve as coordinators of dispersed activities around the globe. So people come to New York, business people, and they set up their headquarters in a place like New York, and they coordinate activities around the world out of that location. And then the last very important driver for the rise of global cities has been the new communication and telecommunication technologies. The telephone and the telegraph, of course, but more recently the internet, video conferencing, and so on and so forth. All of these technologies have made it easier to coordinate activities around the world from one single location. Now let's take a look at some of the largest cities in the world to realize how big they have become. And in a second, we will discuss to what extent they are true global cities. So Tokyo, for instance, has a GDP of about 1,520 billion US dollars. Well, that's the same GDP, roughly speaking, as Australia's. So the entire country of Australia has a GDP that is just a little bit bigger than the GDP for Tokyo, which is a single city, one of the largest in the world, of course. The GDP for New York City is $1,210 billion, and it's slightly bigger than the GDP for all of Mexico. One could say the same thing for Los Angeles, whose GDP is about the same as for the entire country of Turkey. Or Seoul, which is the capital city of South Korea, its GDP is slightly bigger than the GDP for Holland, and so on and so forth. Now, how many of the cities that you see on this table, Tokyo, New York City, Los Angeles, Seoul, London, Paris, Osaka, Chicago, Moscow, Shanghai, are true global cities? That's another question. And I think it's important to discuss different kinds or types of global cities. We come across first the truly global hubs, and I think there are really only two cities in the world that are global hubs. That's London and New York. But we also have regional hubs. These are also global cities in their way, but most of what they do has an effect on the immediate region, not on the entire world. I would perhaps propose the examples of Singapore, Panama, Miami, or Dubai as regional hubs. And then lastly, you have a different type of global cities like Hong Kong or Sydney, which are gateways. So they are gateways into a particular part of the world or into a particular country, Hong Kong being a gateway into China and Sydney being a gateway into Australia. So going back to this table of the largest cities in the world, I would personally say that New York City, perhaps Los Angeles, definitely London, are global hubs and truly global cities. And then the others may play more or less of a role, but on a regional basis as opposed to on a truly global basis. Now, before we leave this segment on global cities, let me ask you a very important question about cities in the world that perhaps you have thought about in the past, which is, why do cities in the world compete against one another to organize global events, such as, for example, the Olympic Games, especially the Summer Olympic Games? And I ask this question because oftentimes it is not clear whether organizing the Olympic Games actually brings any benefits to the city. Sometimes the costs, the investments, and all of the other things that the city needs to put in place in order to organize the Olympics do not compensate. They are far too high. Well, in order to answer that question, you will need to think about the different kinds of benefits that the city may obtain from organizing a global event, such as the Summer Olympics. And of course, you would need to distinguish between benefits in the short term and benefits in the long term. You will also need to distinguish between benefits that are tangible, such as how much money has flown into the city, versus benefits that could be more intangible, like, for example, the reputational benefits. Is the city now better known? Does it have a better image because it just organized the Olympic Games? And then you would also need to consider the benefits that are direct, for example, the jobs that are created as part of the construction effort leading up to the Olympic Games, or the jobs that are created in the hotels hosting the visitors, and so on and so forth. You should perhaps also think about the indirect benefits that are created as a result of the organization of the Olympic Games, and perhaps also about the induced benefits, what are other kinds of activities, other kinds of jobs that are created in the wake of the organization of the Olympic Games. You would need to take into consideration the amount of money invested, the number of jobs created, how many tourists came to the city. You need to consider whether the infrastructure created for the Games can actually be used after the Games are over. You should also consider whether new taxes or higher taxes could be collected during the organization of the Games. You would also need to think about whether there is a possibility for renovating or regenerating or revitalizing some parts of the city as a result of the organization of the Games. And lastly, you would need to take into consideration whether the image of the city has been enhanced, whether its reputation has gained from the organization of the Games. We are not going to go through all of the calculations required to examine each of these aspects. But I would like to tell you that most of the research that has looked into the costs and the benefits of organizing global events, such as the Summer Olympics, for example, conclude that it's actually very rare for a city to benefit from the organization of the Olympic Games, at least in the most tangible and most direct ways. Now, of course, if you include reputational gains, then it's easier to justify the organization of the Games, because obviously the world will be paying attention to the Games and to the city that organizes them. The issue, of course, is how sustainable are those benefits? How sustainable are those gains into the future? It's also important to ask yourself, who pays for that event? Is it just the city, or is it the entire country where the city happens to be located? Is there any crowding out? That is to say, you're organizing the Olympics and you're filling all of the hotels with tourists, but are you scaring other tourists away because they're afraid of the fuss, they're afraid of the traffic, they're afraid of the high prices that normally come together with the organization of the Olympic Games? Are the Games truly transformational for the city? That is to say, is there a before and an after? So the city was not very well known, the city was underdeveloped before the Olympics. And then in the wake of the Olympics, the city is much better known, it is famous, and it attracts more investment and more visitors and more tourists. And of course, you should perhaps also ask yourself the question, does bidding for the Olympics bring most of the benefits of actually hosting them? As you know, several cities always compete every 4 years for the organization of future games. And the very fact that they bid for the Games also gives them quite a bit of publicity. So let me just very quickly review with you what the evidence is about the last few Summer Games. So let's go back all the way to Montreal in Canada, which organized the 1976 Summer Olympics, all the way up until the London Olympics of 2012. You see, most of the research that I've read indicates that there's only perhaps 3 or 4 of these cities that truly benefited from organizing the Games. It wasn't Montreal, 1976, because Montreal was not able to sustain the hype after the Olympics were over. And moreover, Canada, the country, didn't pay for most of the expenses. It was actually the city of Montreal. To this day, which is 40 or 45 years later, we still see that the city and the residents of Montreal are paying bonds that were issued in order to build the infrastructure for the Games back in 1976. The Moscow and the Los Angeles Games were actually not great, and you know the reason. Both of them were overshadowed by political tensions in the world. The US and some of its allies boycotted the Moscow Games in the wake of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So in other words, half of the good athletes in the world didn't compete at the Games. And then, of course, the Soviet Union and some of its allies retaliated against the United States. And so their athletes didn't attend the Games organized in Los Angeles in the year 1984. I would say that perhaps the next Games in 1988 in Seoul, South Korea, were successful. I think a lot of research indicates that Seoul was able to become more of a global city, because prior to the Games, it was more of a provincial kind of town. Most research agrees that the Barcelona Games in 1992 were truly transformational. Barcelona was not very well known as a city outside of Spain or Europe, but after 1992, it truly became a very well-known city, a famous city. And the Games gave Barcelona an opportunity to develop its tourism industry and also to reclaim several parts of the city that had degenerated into industrial wastelands. A big question mark is the Atlanta Games of 1996. So these were games that were very well organized. First city in the American South to ever organize such a global event. And they were mostly successful, except for the small incident with a terrorist attack. The Sydney Games in the year 2000 are also widely considered to be quite successful, truly enabling Sydney to present itself to the world as a very, very important and attractive city. The Games in Athens in 2004 were plagued by all sorts of problems related to the infrastructure, so very little previous research indicates that these were successful games. And then finally, the Games in Beijing and London in the years 2008 and 2012 were reasonably successful. In Beijing, of course, it enabled not just the city, but also the entire country, China, to present itself to the world as a new, upcoming, big economic powerhouse. And the London Games were transformational from the point of, to the city, from the point of view that it enabled certain parts of London to be regenerated and to be revived. So as you can see, out of this list of Olympic Games since the year 1976, it is hard to argue that more than 3 or perhaps 4 cities actually got big benefits out of the organization of the Games. So what we see with this little example about the successes and the failures of the Summer Olympic Games is that some cities in the world have managed over the recent past to become much more visible, much more famous on a global scale by organizing a global sporting event. So when we study demographic trends, we shouldn't stop at just counting people and seeing where they live. We should also take a look at what kind of a life they have. And in particular, we should take a look at their health status. What I would like to do is to illustrate the importance of this topic by looking at what I believe has become the most important health-related epidemic of the 21st century. You see, back in the 20th century, especially in the second half of the 20th century, we thought that the most important health-related risk was smoking. And today, unfortunately, while the smoking epidemic has been arrested in many parts of the world, now what we see is a new kind of widespread health problem emerging in many different parts of the world. And that's obesity or excessive weight. There is an interesting, but at the same time horrifying fact that I would like to share with you. which is that according to the World Health Organization, there are more people in the world right now suffering from obesity or being overweight than people who are suffering from hunger. Official statistics indicate that there's about 800 million people suffering from hunger in the world today. But there are about 1 billion people, that's 200 million people more, who are suffering from obesity or being overweight. Take a look at this table. What you have is the statistics, once again from official sources. For each country, you have the percentage of the population that goes hungry, and then you have the proportion of the population classified as obese. And that number is broken down for men and women. Now let me just tell you before we look at the specific percentages how the rate of obesity in a population is calculated. What official agencies such as the World Health Organization do is use the concept of the BMI, the Body Mass Index. This is an indicator of how much a particular individual weighs relative to his or her height. And it's calculated by using the following formula. It's the weight in kilograms divided by the square of the height expressed in meters. If that indicator is equal or greater than 30, then official statistics classify that person as obese. If the indicator falls between 20 and 30, then official statistics classify that person as overweight. So the percentages of the population that you see on the table, let me remind you, are about obesity, not overweight. And so we see that in the United States, for instance, upwards of 40% of either males or females are obese. These are men and women above age 16. In most parts of Europe, the percentage of the population classified as obese ranges between 10 or 15% and 30 or 35%. The only rich country in the world whose population doesn't exhibit high rates of obesity is Japan, where, as you can see, less than 3% of males and less than 1% of females, or about 1% of females, are obese, classified as obese. The trend over time you cannot see in the table, but I can tell you that if you go to official statistics, you will see that obesity is increasing. The proportion of the population classified as obese or as overweight is increasing all over the world. Not just among adults, among people 16 years of age or more, but also among children, which essentially means that looking down the road, we're going to see higher proportions of the population falling under the category of obese or overweight in the world. So first of all, we should ask ourselves the question, why is obesity on the increase around the world? And I guess there are several kinds of important answers to keep in mind here. The first is that people are increasingly eating bad food, processed food, that essentially contributes to this problem in a major way. This is happening primarily because people are moving away from the countryside to cities in great numbers. And when they move to the cities, they change their habits, and they change especially the kinds of foods that they eat. Also, obesity is growing because of changes in lifestyle. People are more sedentary today than 20 or 30 years ago. People exercise much less. And notice also the connection here to the growth of cities. When people move from the countryside to the city, they do less exercise. How is this affecting the healthcare sector? Well, you can imagine that the spread of obesity around the world will have a big impact on healthcare spending. Why? Well, because obesity is associated with a number of health-related conditions, such as diabetes or heart problems, certain forms of cancer, arthritis, and so on and so forth. Notice that most of these conditions are chronic or can lead to other chronic conditions. And so in the United States alone, it is estimated that about a third of healthcare spending can be traced back to obesity or to people being overweight. Now, the consequences of obesity are not just felt in the healthcare sector. Let's discuss two other industries in which the obesity epidemic is having a large impact. The first is clothing, and then after that we will discuss the case of the automobile industry. So let's take a look at the clothing industry first. This is a very large field of activity. Every year, the industry generates about $1.4 trillion in sales. And of course, the clothing industry is undergoing very rapid change for a number of reasons. The first one is technology, in particular the internet. There's more and more people who are buying their clothes online. This is called e-tailing as opposed to retailing. There's also the growth of cities. As I told you earlier, when people move to the countryside, to the city, they start consuming different types of goods and services. And this is particularly true in the case of clothing. We also see that young people are buying different kinds of clothes these days than when their parents or grandparents were young. We can also see the effects of population aging in the industry, and I will tell you more about them in a second. But let's first talk about the impact of obesity. First of all, when people move to the cities, they start thinking about certain characteristics that they would like to see in what they wear. They want functionality, but they also want style. And of course, cities are everything about speed. And this is why, as you know, many clothing companies around the world have tried to come up with what they call fast fashion. Let's think first about young people. So young people spend a greater percentage of their income on clothes than any other age group. And of course, there is, as you know, a lot of discussion and debate about the so-called millennials, the Y generation. These are the people who were born in the 1990s and in the first few years of the 21st century, the people who are now teenagers or they are in their 20s. Well, some people, some experts, some analysts say that this millennial generation has very specific characteristics such as confidence, tolerance. They have a very strong sense of community. They are, to a very large extent, narcissistic, according to some studies, and they are very hungry for anything that has to do with media and technology. Now, as you can imagine, there's also a ton of research that finds that millennials are not exactly characterized by each of these things. And they show that some of these aspects are actually cliches or stereotypes. But the important thing about what's going on in the clothing industry today as a result of demographic trends is not so much regarding demand of clothes by young people, but rather what happens when people retire, when people reach age 60 or 65. Do they change their pattern of consumption when it comes to clothes? Well, let me first tell you that people age 60 or above account for an increasing share of global clothing sales. Why is that the case? Well, because there's more of them. Remember that populations around the world, especially in Europe, in East Asia, and in the United States, are aging very, very quickly. But you know what? Clothing companies spend 95% of their advertising targeting people under the age of 50. There are some exceptions. Some people mention, for example, Chico's or American Apparel. These two companies are spending more and more of their advertising budgets on people above the age of 60. But most companies in the clothing industry are not changing the way they do advertising or the age segments that they're targeting. Instead, what they're doing is they're trying to grow in parts of the world where the population is younger. In other words, they're trying to escape from population aging in Europe, the United States, or in East Asia. Now, what we also see is that websites on the internet are beginning to target the aging population. So these are smaller companies that are more nimble than established brands, and they're trying to essentially cater to the needs of this expanding segment of the population of the 60-plus-year-olds. We have, for example, the case of Taobao.com in China, which is the largest online shopping bazaar that is now explicitly targeting, when it comes to selling clothes, the population age 50 or above. By October 2013, more than 1.75 million Chinese seniors had shopped using the Taobao.com website, which is quite impressive. In the words of a retired worker in China, and I quote, "Clothes account for most of my spending online." And continued explaining that malls and clothing stores are, quote, "built for her daughter's generation," unquote. So this is interesting to see that in some parts of the world, at least, the population of people above age 50 or age 60 are increasingly turning to online channels in order to find the clothes that they want. Let's now turn to obesity and its impact on the clothing industry. In the United States, in the year 1985, the average woman was a size 8. In the year 2013, the average woman was a size 12 or 14. In the US clothing market, we're talking about $300 billion worth of annual sales. But only about 20% of all of that spending on clothes is accounted for by people classified as obese. But remember from the table that I showed you earlier that nearly half of the US population above age 16 is categorized as obese if you use the body mass index as the standard. So I would like to pose at you the following question. Why is that the case? Why do we see in the US clothing market that 45% or 50% of the population, which is classified as obese, accounts for only 20% of spending on clothes? To be more specific, is this a demand problem or a supply problem? Meaning, is it because of obese people not wanting to buy clothes? That would be a demand problem. Or is it a supply problem? Is it because existing clothing companies do not offer the kinds of clothes that obese people would like to buy? Let me give you a few examples so you can think more about the question as to whether this is a supply problem or a demand problem. So first point is plus size clothing, so that's clothes of size 14 or above, account for less than 20% of clothing sales in the US market. Another point of information, many companies refuse to stock plus sizes or have limited inventory in their stores. For example, Mike Jeffries, who is the CEO of Abercrombie & Fitch, prevents his stores from stocking extra large or extra large sizes in women's clothing. And the justification that he gives for that is the following, quote, "We go after the attractive all-American kid with a great attitude and a lot of friends. A lot of people don't belong in our clothes, and they can't belong," unquote. Another company, Lululemon, shelves its limited size 12 inventory in the back of the store. So you see, most analysts actually conclude, when looking at this problem in depth, that the reason why obese people in the United States account for only 20% of clothing sales is mostly a supply problem. That is to say, the established clothing companies are not doing enough or are not interested in catering to the needs of that demographic segment. Now, some international fashion brands have very slowly begun to pay attention to the obesity segment. In the year 2010, Forever 21, for example, launched Forever 21 Plus, which was a collection of clothes ranging from size 12 to size 20. H&M Plus offers styles up to size 24, but they only make those sizes available in about 3% of all of their designs. There are many other companies that have quickly moved into this space. Romans, Women Within, Juno Active, Plus Woman, making it big. And I expect, of course, more and more entrepreneurs and established firms to pay more attention in the future. Think about it carefully. The fact that the 45% or so of the US population that is in the obese category accounts for only 20% of total spending on clothes means that anywhere between $150 and $180 billion in potential sales of clothes are not being fulfilled in this country. So this represents a tremendous opportunity for entrepreneurs, for small firms, and also for established labels. So this trend is not only affecting dynamics in the clothing industry in a rich country such as the United States. In the emerging economy of India, we also see the same type of dynamic. We are starting to see companies catering to the needs of people in the overweight or obese categories. Corneliani, for instance, which is an Italian suit maker, was losing market share in India until the overseer of his retail operations in that country observed the following: the Indian belly, and I'm quoting, that is the issue. And that's why we have started this made-to-measure service. In other words, the company is now offering special sizes and special designs for people who need them. Since the slowdown in economic growth in India over the last couple of years, more retailers have been targeting the plus-size segment as they see their sales decline in the overall market. This is an analysis made by Abhay Gupta, who is the CEO of New Delhi retail consulting firm Luxury Connect. Lastly, I would like to share with you some thoughts as to how the obesity epidemic may be impacting the automobile industry in the future. There are several kinds of problems that overweight and obese people face when deciding which automobile to buy. The first is whether the seats are appropriate for them. Most automobile seats are designed for people who are not overweight or obese. A second issue is whether the seat belts will work for them or not. Yet a third one, perhaps even more important, is whether the airbags will be dangerous. Because you see, airbags are designed for people of average size. That's one of the main reasons why people with less body mass, like children, are advised not to sit in the front of the car. And lastly, fuel economy is also affected by the amount of weight in the car. If you talk to executives in the global automobile industry, they will tell you that they are taking the obesity epidemic very seriously. They are thinking about ways in which to redesign the seats, the seat belts, and the airbags in automobiles so that they are safe for people who are overweight or obese. And they're also thinking about ways in which they can continue to meet fuel economy standards. So this week, we have started to assess the enormous impact that demographic trends in the world are having on consumer markets, on financial markets, and also on specific industries, such as clothing or automobiles. In future weeks, we're going to take a look at how demography, among other factors, is having an impact on the global economy, on the global geopolitical balance of power, and also on the race for natural resources and energy.